Well, as I said, we were to have a very solemn and serious discussion on life on Mars, but our next guest, or our proposed, a hypothetical guest, had to dodge a Russian spacecraft, which was re-entering our atmosphere. So what were we to do? Well, it so happens that I have about my person a tape we recorded when I was ill a few weeks ago, iller than I am now, and so we're going to pop it in. It's also on the night, of course, when the Nine Network, to their eternal discredit, are running yet again stories about Eric von Daniken, that silly little person I thought we'd crushed like a bug 20 years ago. So what we're doing tonight is we're going to look at the very popular theories in America about this alleged massive cover-up by the United States government following the crash of a, quote, alien spacecraft in New Mexico desert in 1947. It's become known as the Roswell incident and occupies a huge amount of time on the internet. Now, we're going to look also at the question of bodily abductions, which seems to happen to every second American. And I'm joined by Professor John Mack, who won a Pulitzer Prize in his heyday. He's senior lecturer in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and is now notorious as the author of Abduction, a book that tries to make sense of the phenomena of alien abduction, or that's what he believes it does. And he was joined in the studio by Canadian scientist Stanton T. Friedman, who's a lecturer in the area and for 40 years has been wandering around looking at UFOs, and he's the author of Top Secret Magic. Now, I began the chat by saying to John Mack that clearly America is besotted by round things that spin, UFOs, yo-yos, hula hoops, frisbees, and I wondered what it was in the American psyche that made them so susceptible to this sort of mass marketing. What is there in the American psyche that makes Americans such enthusiasts for nonsense?
Well, you have to start by looking at what's going on with the phenomenon itself. Now, something's happening here. There are some objects in the sky that people call UFOs that have been recognized intensely since 1947 and may have been around for centuries before
but John,
that.
my question is, why is it that America seems to be the nexus for the phenomenon?
Well, it's possible that there's a certain kind of technological level of consciousness reached in America so that it can receive and be interested in this phenomenon where other cultures may not. But the phenomenon is of great interest all over the world now. What we've found here in Australia, intense interest. I'm not sure I fully accept that this is somehow an American passion different from what I found in England, what I found in Germany. It's even more intense.
The world is interested, but most of the activity seems to be US-based. Now, for instance,
in the U.S. as opposed to the activity. When I was in France, it was clear in dealing with the number of academics there, they were afraid to say anything publicly because they were afraid they'd lose their job. We have a different attitude in the United States, although John can say that sometimes you're in danger of losing your job for speaking out about
we're aware of the vicissitudes that John's had at Harvard. Stanton, in terms of bodily abductions, surely this is largely focused in the U.S. I mean, I know of people who
John's the one to ask
had
about that, but there have been abductions all over. There have been abductions. There's a new book out where there were more than one group of people involved. Abductions are a worldwide phenomenon.
See, one of the reasons that my friend Dominique Kalamanopoulos and I have been going around the world studying this phenomenon is precisely to discover whether, in fact, it is somehow an American cultural anomaly or is widespread. What we're finding is that these cases exist everywhere. So you just have to ask.
But there are often focused things. I mean, we know that, for instance, prepubescent women in northern France and areas of Spain specialise in seeing visions of the Virgin Mary. Now, they are seen elsewhere, but it is culturally specific as well. I'm just trying to get into the...
He's got cases from Africa that sound just like American cases. I saw the tape the other night.
I have cases from Brazil, cases from countries in Africa, cases from all over Germany, all over the world.
And you don't think, John, this is simply because everyone watches the X-Files now? You don't think that it's simply because the thing has now been so successfully marketed?
X-Files is, about 2 years old, and the intensity of this phenomenon has been going on at least since the Betty and Barney Hill case in the early 60s and probably before.
Now, John, in your view, are we dealing with an actual phenomenon or with metaphor?
Well, one of the things that I've learned in this is that the distinction between reality and metaphor is often not as sharp as we'd like to think. In the Western worldview, we've made this continental divide between image and metaphor and physical reality. This is physical. It manifests in the physical world, and it's also metaphoric. It's also teaching us something about ourselves, about who we are. It is reaching us. It's a phenomenon that comes from we know not where, maybe some other.
It's a phenomenon from without, not a projection from within, in your view.
Again, the phenomenon is a mind-shattering phenomenon. One of the the conceits of mind that it shatters is the idea that there is a sharp distinction between outside and inside. It is both outside and inside. It is real, it is physical, and it is also powerfully transformative psychologically.
Stanton, you've spent decades studying the UFO phenomenon, and I believe you're particularly au fait of the Roswell incident. Would you like to run that past the listener?
Okay, in July 1947, 2 weeks after the beginning of what we might describe as the modern flying saucer phenomenon, the term UFO wasn't used until after 1950, so it's okay to use the term flying saucer. At the end of a period in which we now know there were at least 2,000 sightings in 44 states and several other countries, apparently there was a mid-air collision northwest of Roswell, New Mexico, out in the middle of nowhere, with two vehicles coming down, one near the little tiny town of Corona, another not near any town, 160 miles west, and with bodies being recovered by the military in both cases. With some of the witness from the first case, a rancher stumbles across wreckage. He goes into town a few days later to Roswell. The sheriff calls the base. The base is very special. It's the home of the only atomic bombing group in the world, the 509th. High security, hand-picked officers. Naturally, they are concerned with anything that goes on in the area that might be spies. They send people out, they bring wreckage back, and the military takes over from there. There was an announcement made at the direct order of the commander of the base, who later went on to be a four-star general, Butch Blanchard, Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force when he died of a heart attack. There was a press release put out at noon July 8th saying that they'd recovered the wreckage of a flying disc. This created a great stir all over the world. 5 hours later, his boss, General Roger Ramey, head of the 8th Air Force, puts out a release saying that, well, they made a mistake. It was really the wreckage of a radar reflector from a weather balloon. By the next day, the story was over and done until I got involved 31 years later. As we've talked to hundreds of witnesses, many of them first-hand direct involvement in this case, it's become clear that there was an intentional cover-up, that there was wreckage that was extraordinary. For example, the base intelligence officer, Major Jesse Marcel, his son is a medical doctor, a pilot, a flight surgeon, served on military aircraft accident investigative teams. He handled pieces of the wreckage. He has never seen anything like that, and he's seen a lot of wreckage. So we got lots of good people involved. It's clear, wreck, recovery, cover-up.
The recent Fox television autopsy material, do you regard that as kosher?
No, I don't regard it as kosher. If there was anything Trafe on the air, that was certainly it. I was called in by Fox. I was interviewed for it. I saw the whole thing, all 20 minutes, several times over, and I met with the exploiter of the film. Everything he told me the first time around, and continued the second time around, turned out to be a lie. So I can't tell you who made it. I wish I could, but it's not legitimate.
Nonetheless, you passionately believe that we are, in fact, living in the era of a cosmic Watergate, which is the biggest story of the millennium.
It's easy to prove. I do it in all my lectures. I'll do it Friday night in Melbourne by showing the blacked-out documents from the National Security Agency and the CIA, Freedom of Information used. They admit they have all these UFO documents and they're not releasing any of them.
Stanton, I wrote a satire on the JFK movie, and I was trying to think of other possible theories for the assassination. And so I had the chauffeur do it. I had Jackie do it for the insurance money, and I had it done by extraterrestrials. I was suddenly bombarded with tons and tons and tons of top-secret documents, top-secret, splattered all over them. Beautifully done, I've got to tell you. Dull facsimiles thereof, suggesting that not only was this true, but in fact America was already run by extraterrestrials.
There's a good line.
The blues and the... No, in other words, I've seen a lot of fake documents.
Of course.
You must see a lot of fake documents.
So have I. In my book, Top Secret Magic, I identify a number of documents as fakes and give the reasons why. I have a big gray basket. Maybe. Not black, not white. Maybe. The documents that I talk about in there, the Majestic 12 documents that I say are genuine, are ones that have stood the test of 12 years of investigation and visits to 15 archives and examination. I mean, I wrote classified documents myself.
Okay. Let's look at this paradigm shift that you're alluding to, John. What do you see? What are the yearnings that is expressed in the abductee stories? What are people getting out of them spiritually, psychologically?
It's the lack of yearnings that made me believe it. In other words, if the yearnings were obvious, then I would have been more doubtful of the reality of what I was hearing. It's the fact that the people want anything else to be true that made me think there was something to this. In other words, I found no case among the ones that I consider authentic, and I've now worked intensively with about 120 people and had interviews with many others.
And back off the mic just a little. We're getting some feedback.
They report with great concern that I'll think they're crazy. They want to be told that this is some kind of problem that can be fixed, and they will then, with appropriate doubt and skepticism, little by little, say, well, I had this experience, this strange light came in, I was paralyzed, there were these funny little men around me, and they took me through a wall. I know you're going to think I'm crazy, Doc, but this is what happened, and they haven't talked to anybody about it because they think they're going to be found mad. This at least used to be the case, and little by little this picture emerges, case after case after case. Details not in the media.
I was going to say, John, that you're aware how quick it is to build up a media feedback loop where people can start to learn the ropes.
Researchers hold back data, and when you find independently the same kind of little bits of pieces of information that don't appear anywhere, you got to say they're independent. Right, John?
The media tends to follow the experiences. Alan Hynek, for example, was a consultant on Close Encounters of the Third Kind, not the other way around, as it often gets said, that this phenomenon was somehow a product of the movie. On the contrary, the movie took its data from what was already known from the UFO community.
I'm glad you raised Hynek. It seemed to me that over the years, his views of the phenomenon, and I'm talking UFOs here, not bodily abductions, evolved, it changed. He was a nuts and bolts man in the beginning. He was a wrathful incident man, if you like. But towards the end, he was talking mystically. He was talking very, very differently about the phenomenon.
Well, I think it was really the other way around. Alan had problems early on and wasn't willing to speak out pro-UFO, if you will. There might be possibly someday something interesting here. But after he got out of Project Blue Book, after it was closed, and he set up his Center for UFO Studies, he took a much more pro-UFO viewpoint. But Alan had a serious difficulty, two of them actually, that I can think of offhand. One, as he once said to me, Stan, 90% of scientists don't believe in UFOs. He was very wary of that. It isn't a true statement if he meant astronomers over the age 60, probably. But more importantly, Alan, as with many astronomers, wasn't able to do his homework with regard to interstellar travel. So he was stuck with a real problem. There seems to be something going on here, but you can't get here from there, so there must be something mystical, if you will.
Right, that's the point, though. He did finally express that argument, that we weren't talking about travel in the normal sense at all. We were talking about something else.
Because he didn't know any. I could never get him to do the homework on interstellar travel. There are loads of studies by engineers, not by astronomers, that show that trips to nearby stars within our local neighborhood, 54 light years is 1,000 stars, 46 like the sun, that's far enough to be concerned about. Trips to such stars with reasonable round-trip times, shorter than the average person's lifetime, are feasible using staged fission or fusion propulsion systems, on both of which I have worked, and on which the work was not done in academia, but in industrial contracts from the government. So as soon as you get around the problem of can you get here from there, that changes everything. Alan was honest. He saw a puzzle, a phenomena that he couldn't explain, where real people were having real experiences, but how can we explain them if you can't get here from there? So he goes into other dimensions
I get the point.
and stuff.
John, I know you've been through hell at Harvard. Are your colleagues in deep denial, in your view? Are you surrounded by people who simply won't know, don't want to know?
I've seen some really weird responses from colleagues. They range. Some of the people, if I can get them into the room when I'm doing a session, no matter how skeptical they are, they come out shaking their head and saying, wow, I see what you mean. There's something going on here. I know that woman, and she's not making this up. This is powerful. This is real. This is something that she could not be fabricating. But the ones that just get a report, or they have a brief time with somebody, but it's not a full session, I get some really weird stuff. Oh, that sounds like a hysteric. I mean, that person is, that's a masochistic reaction to whatever. You know, the usual Freudian nonsense gets thrown at it where it doesn't fit at all. Or this is a displacement from sexual trauma. I mean, they don't do the homework. They don't sit down with these people, spend several hours with them, and see that it doesn't fit any kind of psychiatric syndrome. It acts like real experience. It's not my fault that the real experience ain't supposed to be.
But you also are aware, of course, of the great anxieties that are expressed, increasingly expressed, about a parallel or a similar phenomenon in some ways, repressed memory. You're aware of this spreading like a contagion across America.
You're talking about the false memory syndrome argument. Now, the false memory syndrome is a mixed political and scientific matter. It arose because a lot of very nice, upstanding, middle-class men and women, fathers and mothers, were being accused by their daughters or sons of sexual abuse. And in some instances, the minority, not the majority, therapists overly zealously were encouraging them to come up with those stories.
Over their patients.
That's a far cry from a person deeply, passionately talking of a disturbing, traumatic
John, the analogy
experience.
I'm trying to suggest is an obvious one. That is that after a while, false memory syndrome takes off in America. Now, there is a feedback loop. People learn the script. They know the ropes. They know the sort of things they've got to claim to have experienced. Could this not be happening with the people you're talking to?
Probably not. In other words, the false memory situation occurs when something is suggested to a person. Like there's a well-known researcher, Elizabeth Loftus, who plants memories in people's minds that they were lost in a supermarket. It's suggested to them, and they come up with confirmatory data with no feeling tone, just kind of going along with the hypnotist. This isn't like that. There's no evidence that false memory exists in a situation where a person comes up passionately, intensely, with terror, with feeling, with emotion, appropriate to an event that has happened, with nothing to gain from it.
Well, hang on.
It isn't even argued that false memory applies in those situations.
But there is something to gain, isn't there? Isn't there something to gain from being a member of a besieged minority? I know the feeling. I was a member of the Communist Party in Australia, which is a very odd thing to be.
Now I understand the direction of this conversation.
But it actually gave you a great sense of being special. You were under attack, you were reviled, you were treated as a nutcase, but it was great to feel that you belonged to this unpopular group.
Most abductees don't want their name used, don't want their face shown in public.
Communists didn't want either.
Yeah, but see, in a communist situation, you are part of something you believe in. It may not be popular, but at least it's something about which you have some conviction.
But your people believe.
They start out quite the contrary. They start out saying, look, I have no interest in UFOs. I never saw an alien before this, but this happened to me. It doesn't make any sense to me. I have no interest in this. Why me?
John, every time Shirley MacLaine made a public statement, she'd always preface it by saying, I was always a skeptic, but every time I interview a bigot, they say, I'm not a racist, but... Okay, let's look at, Stanton, your realm. Let's move off from the bodily abductions to the hard evidence. It seems to me that your whole belief system is predicated on the possibility of the biggest cover-up in human history. How can you imagine that this is possible, even if it was possible to bottle it up in the US of A? How can it not break out in France, in the UK?
But who says it isn't? When you talk to researchers overseas, you find the same thing happening. Belgium is an exception. The Belgian Defense Command, whatever their official name is, has shared data with scientists who were interested in UFOs, F-16 radar charts and this sort of thing. But they're by far the exception. There is an Official Secrets Act in England. There are people
which
in Spain...
is regularly rubbished and ignored.
Because some things leak out doesn't mean everything does. With an annual black budget in the United States of $35 billion, according to Tim Weiner, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, New York Times correspondent in Washington, with that much money being spent in secret without congressional approval, except for two guys who know what's going on, supposedly, then it's easy to understand, or call it a conspiracy. I don't use the term conspiracy. I worked on classified programs. I don't consider those programs conspiracies.
And if someone blew a whistle, what would happen to them?
I don't know what you mean.
If someone broke the code, if someone came out and said, look, this is happening, here's evidence.
Well, the likelihood of that happening seems to be small. There was one Daniel Ellsberg. There are billions of pages of classified documents. You don't get a clearance without being vetted very, very carefully. I don't know people who've broken security.
How about a scientist like Sagan, Carl Sagan, who's running SETI? Surely it's in his interest to agree with you guys rather than to ridicule.
I don't think so at all. I was in Carl's home a couple of years ago before he got sick. We were classmates for 3 years. His statements over the years have clearly reflected total prejudice and a total lack of awareness of the facts. Look at his new book, Demon Haunted World. I deal with this in one of the chapters of Top Secret Magic. His most commonly referenced source of data, he's got a long reference list, but about UFOs, it's Weekly World News, a third-rate tabloid. There's no mention of the 2 large-scale scientific conferences that he was a contributor to. He even edited the proceedings of one of those conferences published by Cornell University, his school. Ignore the data.
Can I say something about this? Take the SETI program itself. Can you imagine anything sillier? Here you have a potentially advanced race of beings with technologies perhaps tens of thousands of years ahead of us. But we think that if we send some radio waves up there, little blips, that they're going to say, oh, that's nice, and come back to us in our technology. That's, someone once quipped, that's about as culture-bound as taking a huge searchlight and looking into the heavens trying to find a good Italian restaurant.
Now, what I'm suggesting is that Sagan would be one of the political and financial beneficiaries of...
He'd lose all his funding for SETI. He would have to admit that he had been mistaken for 30 years and had influenced many other people, and that he had blindly accepted Phil Klass's UFO attacks. Carl doesn't do any investigation himself. He refers to Klass.
Okay, final question to you, John Mack. Do you think that the phenomena you're examining are being censored, shut up? Are they subject to some sort of top-level conspiracy to stop them being debated?
The subject of abductions. I've had, if I understand your question, I've had no contact from the government, from any officials, any indication anybody's trying to stop this work. My sense is that the awareness that this is a real phenomenon is growing. More and more clinicians are seeing cases, reporting the cases. Increasingly, even mainstream foundations, we have 2 mainstream foundations that are now supporting our research, which is practically unheard of in this field. It's becoming something that is of interest. Even my Harvard group you referred to has encouraged my research to continue after a 14-month, rather arduous go-to-it with them, and they say, bring in more colleagues, have a working group, study it from all angles. Fine, I welcome it. It was very hard to find colleagues a couple of years ago that were willing to look at it.
Now, that was Stanton T. Friedman and Professor Mack, John Mack, and that was, without question, was my worst ever interview, Gladys. Now, to punish myself, I'm going to be taken aboard a UFO and canonically irrigated by little blokes that look like Bill McMahon. Now, tonight on LNL, our weekly chat with the Canberra Babylonian Margot Kingston. And we're looking at hermits. Hermits! A history of hermits and their current revival in the UK. I love hermits. I'm going to be a hermit when I grow up. And a timely look at some of the details of Aboriginal women's business. See you then, little after 10. Behave yourselves.